everyone, this is Giselle Miralles, one of the faculty members in the Writing Support Center, and today I am presenting a workshop on college writing and avoiding the 5-paragraph essay. If you haven't already, please go ahead and download the processing worksheet. It is available in both PDF and Word. Once you download this worksheet, you will be filling it out as we go along in this presentation. And once you complete it, you can also turn it into your professor if they are offering extra credit for completing a workshop. So if you haven't already, like I said, go ahead and download that before we begin. All right, so as I mentioned, today's workshop will be focusing on the 5-paragraph essay. And during this workshop, I hope to define the 5-paragraph essay model and what that is. I also want you to reflect on the pros and cons of the 5-paragraph model. And I also want you to learn how to transition from the 5-paragraph essay to a college level writing style. So that is what we will be doing for today's workshop. So to start off, what is a 5-paragraph essay? If you're straight out of high school, I would assume you're probably very familiar with this essay style. It's something that high school students are generally taught. And it might vary based on who your teacher was, but some form of the 5-paragraph essay would have been taught to you sometime during high school. The way it's organized is that it begins with a general introduction and a thesis statement that lists the essay's 3 main points, and then it's followed by 3 paragraphs that focus on these points. So like I said, it's 3 different distinct points within the thesis statement, like a list, and then the writer generally proceeds to explain each of those points in the following 3 paragraphs. After those paragraphs are done, the final paragraph provides a summary of the essay's main points, and you will have 5 paragraphs once you've completed an essay using this format. So before we begin talking more about the 5-paragraph essay, I just want you to go ahead and reflect on your experience with it. So considering the definition of a 5-paragraph essay that we just covered, what was your experience with the 5-paragraph essay in high school? Did you use this method? If so, what sorts of writing skills did you learn while using this method? So go ahead and reflect on that. You can do so on the worksheet I mentioned at the beginning. It's question number 1. And once you're ready, you can go ahead and resume the workshop. So go ahead and pause here, complete that, and then resume once you're finished. Okay, so I hope you all had enough time. If not, go ahead and continue pausing so that you can finish writing your reflection. And I do want to explain why high school students are taught the 5-paragraph method. We're already a little bit through, I think we're in week 6 of the fall semester right now as I record this workshop. So you've probably already turned in an essay, and you might have already been told that you do not want to write in the 5-paragraph method style. But if that's the case, why do teachers keep teaching this in high school? The reason why is it introduces high school students to academic writing in a very simplified way. You can think of it as training wheels. So if you're learning to ride a bike, you have your training wheels on, and the 5-paragraph essay sort of works that way for writing. It's because it's just meant to get you acquainted with how to write, and it's not supposed to be something you continue doing in college. It allows you to understand the basics of organization in an essay, so it's much easier to think of an essay in 5 paragraphs. So that's why it's taught in high school. And then college admission exams like the SAT actually look for a 5-paragraph essay format. This is in part because it is a timed exam. So the 5-paragraph essay format leans itself really well to the SAT. So it is taught because it does have some benefits when you are in high school. However, once you leave high school, you do need to transition from that style to a more nuanced and collegiate style of writing. So why don't 5-paragraph essays work well for college writing? The reason why is because if you think back to high school, a lot of the coursework tends to focus on just the facts. Like if you think about history, when you're in history class in high school, you generally get the events that happened, but you don't get quite the commentary on why those events happened, the repercussions of those events. You don't get the nuance of all those things. So the 5-paragraph essay is good for something like high school coursework that does just focus on the facts. However, once you're in college, the courses ask you to delve deeper and consider the how and why of a topic. You're asked more so to analyze and interpret facts, which you might not have been asked to do in high school. But in college, when you write an essay, you want to be able to really think about why the facts you're talking about matter. That's the really big difference between high school and college writing. Is college is more nuanced, and your assignments will ask you to interpret and analyze facts rather than just giving your reader the facts. And with the 5-paragraph essay model, it really lends itself to wanting to give your reader just facts and not really analyze and talk about those facts. So that's why in college you need to transition away from that 5-paragraph essay model. Other reasons why the 5-paragraph model is not suitable for college writing is because they do a poor job of setting up the framework or often context of an essay. So the 5-paragraph model, when you do write these essays, you generally write a very general introduction. So what that means is usually in a 5-paragraph essay, the student essentially writes an introduction that states a bunch of general facts. I will be showing you an example of what that actually looks like, but this is something you want to avoid when you write your college level essay. You want to be more specific when you're writing your college level essay, and your introduction should connect with your argument. Versus in the 5-paragraph essay, it's just a general introduction that doesn't really go into the details you need your reader to know in order to understand your argument. Another thing about 5-paragraph essays is they often lack an argument. This is because like I said, the introduction is general. So when the introduction is general, that means that the thesis isn't going to be much better. For example, like I said, these 5-paragraph essays usually have a listing type of thesis instead of a thesis that talks about the reason as to why your argument matters. So for example, a 5-paragraph essay might have a thesis like, I will show you how the Romans lost their empire in Britain and Gaul by examining military, technology, religion, and politics. So there's no argument there. The writer is just letting the reader know that they're going to be discussing the technology, religion, and politics of Rome, but not quite why Rome lost their empire because of these things. So like I said, it's just listing 3 things they're going to talk about in the essay without getting into the nuance of how these things might have led to the fall of Rome. So there is no argument, it's just a statement of facts more often than not. 5-paragraph essays are also often repetitive. The reason why is because generally once you write your thesis, the 3 topics that are listed in that thesis are the introduction, or not the introduction, but they are generally the topic sentences for each of the 3 paragraphs that will follow. So it's just a repetition of what you had said in the thesis, and then the conclusion is also repetitive because it tends to be a summary of what was talked about in the essay rather than a so what, or why your reader should care about what you just argued in your essay. There's also often a lack of flow within 5-paragraph essays, and that's because there's not many smooth transitions from one thought to the next. This is because the listing type of thesis statement encourages writers to treat each paragraph and main idea as separate from one another, rather than forcing you to draw connections between paragraphs and ideas in order to develop an argument. So without that connection between ideas, it just seems a little clunky and thrown together without the flow that should be in college level essays. There's also often weak conclusions, like I mentioned. They're generally summaries of the introduction and what the paper was about, and they don't really do anything to engage readers and make them glad that they read the essay. So if you're more interested in how to make a strong conclusion, we actually have a workshop on that you can refer to after this if you want to know more about how to write a strong conclusion. But just listing a summary, which is what the 5-paragraph model encourages, is not a strong conclusion paragraph. Another reason why the 5-paragraph model is not suitable is because they are often too rigid and simplified to connect to real world situations. So what that means is that when you're writing about certain topics and you're going in and you're writing about those topics in the 5-paragraph essay style, you're not often being very persuasive in that situation. And it's much harder to connect to real life events or real world examples because it's such a rigid format. Having to follow a format versus just thinking about your content really limits you. So it's much too simplified in both argument and the way it's written in order to connect to real world situations. And lastly, like I mentioned, form takes precedence over content with the 5-paragraph essay. However, content should always come before form. What that means is that when you write the 5-paragraph essay, you're more focused on how you're organizing it into these 5 paragraphs, versus when you write a college essay, you want to think more about what are you writing about, what is your argument, what is your content, and what are you going to tell your readers about your topic. You think more about what you're writing versus how you're organizing what you're writing. While organization is important, content should guide your organization versus letting organization guide your content. So how do you move towards a college level essay? These are some tips that you can use in order to move that way. And one tip I have is, instead of focusing on the format, move towards focusing on your argument. And you can ask yourself, what is your main argument? How will you answer the prompt? So what that means is, essentially, as I was mentioning before, the problem with the 5-paragraph essays, it focuses more on the organization and not the content. And when you focus on your argument, you can really think about what you actually want to write and what you need to say in order to prove your argument. And it's less thinking of, okay, this paragraph is going to be about this paragraph is going to be about this, and more thinking about, what do I want my readers to take away from my paper? So when you approach writing, you should definitely think about your content before you think about organization. Like I said, organization is important, but content always comes before your organization. After you've narrowed down your argument, you also want to organize your draft by thinking about how the argument's parts fit together. So say you've come up with a working thesis, and I say working because oftentimes you'll notice that your thesis will evolve as you begin writing. And that's another thing the 5-paragraph essay doesn't allow you to do, is it doesn't allow you to really evolve and grow your thesis, versus a college level essay should allow for that wiggle room. So if you're writing your argument and you realize, oh no, I don't really cover this in my thesis, you can always go back and have your thesis be in line with your argument more. So after you've actually thought about your argument, then you can start thinking about how to organize your draft and how the argument's parts fit together. So you're instead thinking of argument points and not paragraph topics, if that makes sense. You also want to think about, when you're writing your introduction, you don't want to begin with a general statement. For example, sometimes when students begin writing, they tend to say, there are many things, for example, there are many things in life that are hard to, let me think. So in the example paragraph I'm going to show you all, The first sentence is, a civil war occurs when two sides in a single country become so angry at each other that they turn to violence. So that's a very general introduction sentence, right? It doesn't really tell me much about what the paper is going to be about. It's just a observation about wars in general. So you don't want to start your introduction with a general statement. You want to make sure that your introduction has facts in it, or not facts, but rather information in it that will help your reader understand your argument. You don't want to give your reader unnecessary information. So focus on narrowing down what your reader needs to know about your argument. So for example, if you're writing a paper on a book, it's going to be important that you talk about the author, or you mention the author's name and you talk about the text. And what about the text the reader needs to know? You don't need to give a full summary of the text because that would take too much time, but you would need to give your reader an idea of what the text is about so that they can understand how it relates to your argument. So that's what I mean by not being general. I mean focusing your argument and the information in your introduction to match your argument so that your reader isn't getting unnecessary information. You also want to decide how to organize the information needed to support your argument. So like I said, this comes after you've already narrowed down your argument. You want to make sure that you decide what each of your paragraphs will focus on, but not in a way where you're saying, this paragraph I will talk about this topic, this paragraph I will talk about this topic. So it's less of how you think about it in the 5-paragraph method style and more so, what do you need to talk about to support your argument? So for example, do you need to give a paragraph about background information in order to get your reader acquainted? Do you need to talk about the differences about one of the topics you're talking about in one paragraph? It all depends on what you want to talk about in your essay. And like I said, you want to focus more on how these parts will flow together versus if you have enough paragraphs. This generally comes more naturally as you're writing because maybe you'll have a big block of text and you're like, oh, this is too much text. And you'll naturally want to break up the paragraph. And you might be able to find something in that paragraph that allows you to break it up. So maybe somewhere in the paragraph you veer off and start talking about a different topic. And that would be a great way to divide up that paragraph. So like I said, this is a much more natural and holistic way of organizing and less of you following a format to make sure you have 5 paragraphs. You also want to use your conclusion to explain why your argument matters. So instead of providing a summary of your paper, remind your reader as to why your argument is important and what they should take away from that argument. So it gives your paper more of a so what. It allows your reader to connect with the argument more instead of just providing a summary for your argument. If you provide a summary, then it will be something that the reader will have already heard and it won't give you that lasting impact that you want to impart on your reader. So just make sure your argument or your conclusion explains why that argument matters. So I want to do one more activity with you all, and this is to help you transition away from the 5-paragraph essay. So after you've read the introduction paragraph below, take note of what can be improved. On your worksheet, there's a space for this that has the questions and the sample paragraph on it. Go ahead and answer the following questions on your worksheet. The following questions are, how can you tell the student is writing based on the 5-paragraph model? What tips might you give the student to improve their paragraph? So the sample paragraph reads, a civil war occurs when two sides in a single country become so angry at each other that they turn to violence. The Civil War between North and South was a major conflict that nearly tore apart the young United States. The North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons. In some cases, these reasons were the same, but in other cases, they were very different. In this paper, I will compare and contrast these reasons by examining the economy, politics, and slavery. So this is a 5-paragraph this this is a paragraph that was written in the 5-paragraph essay style. So just think about how you can tell that the student is writing that way and what tips might you give them to improve this paragraph. So go ahead, take a minute to write your answer on your worksheet, and once you're done, feel free to continue the video. Okay, so I hope you had enough time. If not, you can go ahead and pause and continue writing. I do want to show you what this paragraph looks like after it's been improved upon. So before we move on to that, I do want to talk about why this is a 5-paragraph essay introduction. And the reason why, if you look at this first sentence, civil war occurs when two sides in a single country become so angry at each other that they turn to violence. This is a very, very general introductory sentence. It doesn't tell me what the paragraph is about. So as a reader, I could read this and think that this essay is about anything. The Civil War between North and South was a major conflict that nearly tore apart the young United States. So this is also very summary sounding. It just says that this was a major conflict, but it doesn't tell me why it was a major conflict. And that's what I mean when I say you need to explain the why and the how, instead of just listing facts. The North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons. Again, this is very general. It doesn't tell me much about why the Civil War was fought, and it gives a very general reasoning as to say for many reasons. So I don't know what that means as a reader. I don't know what reasons they're referring to. In some cases, these reasons were the same, but in other cases, they were very different. Again, a very general sentence, and it doesn't tell me much about what this essay is going to be about. It doesn't tell me about the writer's perspective on what happened during the Civil War. It doesn't even tell me what the Civil War was about, because there's a lot of generalizations, like for many reasons, very different. It doesn't tell me much about the actual reasons as to why the US went to a civil war. And then they state, I will compare and contrast these reasons by examining the economy, politics, and slavery. This is a statement. It is not an argument. It does not have a so what as to why I should care as a reader. It does not have a why, as in why did these, the North and South go to the Civil War? And it doesn't tell me why I should care about this argument. Again, it isn't an argument, it's more of a statement, and this is typically the type of writing that occurs with the 5-paragraph essay. Now, if the student were to improve this paragraph by using college writing techniques, this is what it might look like. So this is the same topic, just improved. The United States broke away from England in response to British tyranny and oppression, so opposition to tyranny and a belief in individual freedom and liberty were important values in the young republic. But in the 19th century, slavery made Northerners and Southerners see these values in very different ways. By 1860, the conflict over these values broke out into a civil war that nearly tore the country apart. In that war, both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against tyranny and oppression, but Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their rights to property and self-government. So this paragraph is much more specific. This writer outlines the reasons as to why the Civil War broke out. It gives a little bit of background that the reader needs to know in order to understand their argument. And their argument is that both of these groups, the Northerners and the Southerners, believe they fought against tyranny and oppression, but each group focused on a different reason why. Versus the previous version of this essay simply says, I will compare and contrast these reasons by examining the economy, politics, and slavery. On the other hand, this paragraph really provides an argument that explains what they're going to be talking about, and it's much more specific in how they're approaching this argument. So this actually gives the reader more of a preview of what they're going to be writing about, versus this is much more general and it doesn't let the reader know what exactly they're going to be talking about, except something about economy, politics, and slavery, versus I really understand where this reader or writer is going with their argument. So this is what a college level paragraph looks like, and this is what a high school level paragraph looks like. Lastly, some of you might be asking the question, is it ever okay to write a 5-paragraph essay in college? And the answer is yes, but only in very specific situations. It's a great way to write your in-class essays. The reason why is because with in-class essays, you generally have a short amount of time to get something written, and it's easy to just plug in information when writing in-class essays with the 5-paragraph essay. So when you do write in-class essays, you could use a 5-paragraph essay if that is easier for you. We actually have a workshop on in-class essay writing, so if you're interested in that, you should go ahead and check that out. You can also use this format when you write a short speech, so it's easy to think about your points if you have this format. But obviously just a short speech. If you're writing a more detailed speech, you might want to think more about how to write it in a college level style. You also want to avoid writing a listening thesis. So you always want to avoid that for, even if you're writing an in-class essay using the 5-paragraph essay format or a speech, you just want to move away from that listing thesis. Like I said, when you list the 3 things you're going to talk about, that doesn't give your reader much of a preview of what you're actually arguing. It's just a list of things that you're going to mention in your essay. So always avoid writing that list thesis and always focus on writing an actual argument, even if you are using the 5-paragraph essay model. So just a quick recap of what was covered. 5-paragraph essays are a great introduction to academic writing, which is why they're taught in high school. But as you continue your writing career in college, you want to become more nuanced, and you want to think more about the how and why whenever you write your arguments. You also want to focus more on providing more than just the facts. So you don't want to just list facts. You want to explain to your reader why what you're arguing matters. You also want to make sure that you're using the 5-paragraph essay only for in-class writing and short speeches. But even when you do use this format, you want to make sure that you're writing a solid argument or thesis statement. Lastly, this presentation was taken from the Writing Center, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is actually this presentation is actually based on an article that they wrote about the 5-paragraph essay. So if you're interested in reading more, I would highly suggest that you go over to their website and check it out. As far as other workshops that you could check out to help improve your writing, we have plenty on introduction writing, research paper writing, body paragraphs, conclusions. So if you want more insight into how to actually write a college level essay, please go ahead and check out our other workshops. If you have any questions, you can always email Writing Support Center at pasadena.edu. Thank you.